Hello, everybody, and welcome for another session of Interface by API Days. So, this session, we are joined by Pooja Mistry, and the topic will be designing APIs that stand the test of time. So, first of all, Pooja, we would appreciate if you can introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you, and what is your role in your company, please.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Pooja. I am a developer advocate at Postman, and I'm so excited to be sharing my session with you, which is all about designing APIs that stand the test of time. So, for those of you who don't know, Postman is a API platform that has over 25 million users worldwide. And for many teams, Postman is a tool that helps them work with APIs more effectively. So, as a dev advocate, I'm really glad to be able to share with everyone more knowledge on Postman's API platform's capabilities, as well as all the new features that we always have coming out. So, we're here today because we're moving towards an API first world. APIs are the cornerstone of most of the technologies that we have available. With Postman, we believe that APIs users, the platform is for both the producers of APIs, which are the creators of APIs, as well as the consumers of APIs. So ultimately, we wanted to build a platform that supports this, our trend of moving towards this API first world. So let's talk about what exactly is API first. But before we talk about that, let's talk a little bit about maybe something you're familiar with, which is code first development. So with code first development, you can start off with the core code functionality. And then usually when you're done, you'll probably need to create an API that to build out your first web app. And then there are some users that might tell you that you might need support. So there are probably some other apps that you might need to create to support that API that will support that API. And then you might need to have another service, which is a microservice, and this is for your internal consumers rather than your external consumers. And then you might need to create a completely different API to support internal consumers versus external consumers. And so essentially you have this workflow where you're building completely different APIs for different functionalities. And oftentimes it can lead to your backend not being fully connected, or you can have some sort of disconnect in this case. So when it comes to API first, you're thinking about your first consumers at hand. And then you're working with your engineers to apply your API to those consumers, and then you're paving that way for other platforms and services. So essentially, with API first, what you're trying to do is that you're basically trying to design it based on your consumer's use case versus code it based on initially, and then think about design a little bit later. So the term API first means different things. So I like to think of it as a model for software development, but some may associate API first with API first design. So essentially, it's an organizational mindset that allows you to think about API development model in which APIs are designed before they are implemented. And it's for all types of organizations, and it's essentially not only just for startups, but it's for any organization that wants to take on the idea of first designing their APIs based on their consumers. So essentially, the API first strategy involves many different building blocks to create solutions that are products that can save time or money and that ultimately generate some more value. So the design of an API can contribute by having a lot of these 8 traits, but the core base of API design is essentially what problem is your API trying to solve? So, and is your API trying to solve that in the right way? So in this case, some of these 8 effective designs are alignment with your organization's goals. So APIs allow the API you built has to have some sort of purpose and achieve something. So it must be aligned to whatever your organization is contributing to. The reusability of an API, whether that API can be used on multiple different applications, the interoperability of the API, the ability of an API to be used across many different teams, the ability of that API to evolve. So being able to enhance that API with new or existing features, making that API adaptable to change. Its user friendliness, which allows users to better interact with that API, also reduce that time to first call. And then, of course, you have security, which is always a big concern when it comes to web APIs and what operations are exposed to whom. And then efficiency, which involves the performance of an API. And then finally, pragmatism, which involves solutions that can be too tricky or complex to implement, and ultimately there's some sort of cost associated to building that. So these are the 8 different traits of API first development, and I have my colleague Arnaud actually wrote a wonderful blog article about this that I'm happy to share about API first design with you all. So why this is important is because it impacts the experience of APIs. So essentially, there are 3 different types of APIs. So for public, private, and partner APIs, the impact of a good API experience can lead to more usability, reusability, time to value, APIs that evolve smoothly, and less risks when it comes to introducing breaking changes. However, with the impact of a bad API can lead to higher costs and decreased productivity, and of course, longer time for integration and shift in delivery dates. So with public APIs, they're publicly available to everyone in the world to consume, whereas partner APIs are exposed to strategic business partners, and partner APIs are exposed to strategic business partners versus private APIs, which are more internal and they're hidden outside the organization. So as you can see, there are 3 different types of use cases when it comes to working with APIs, and designing them with an API first approach, understanding the user's needs leads to a better experience in general. So I wanted to kind of talk about the better practices for good API designs. And we'll dive into some of these today, as I have an example of an API that we're going to talk about. But essentially, we'll be talking about naming, data modeling required, error handling, documentation, and consistency. So with these things in mind, you can ensure that your API lasts and is available to stand the test of time when it comes to interoperability and meeting those 8 cases of API first strategies. So with that, I like to take an example of using Open API specification. So Open API specification, it describes REST, or it describes in a APIs in sort of a REST-ish fashion, uses JSON schemas to describe data. It's written in JSON and YAML, and it's vendor neutral and technologically agnostic. So within Postman, we have the Open API definitions as a part of our API builder, where you're able to design your APIs in such a way. So I wanted to take this example of brewing a coffee. So my colleague Arnaud and I, earlier this year, we did a intergalactic session. So if you're not familiar with intergalactic, it's Postman's webinars, and you're able to join a session and learn all about Postman and all of its features in a more intuitive way. So in this session, we created an API around a use case about brewing coffee. And so in this example, we wanted to demonstrate how to create an API for users. For example, how to get a coffee, which is what, and then steps how to choose a coffee beans, which is how. So in this example, we wanted to create some APIs for this use case. So for example, choosing a coffee bean, and then brewing a coffee, which is which allows you to eventually have the end product once you've chosen your beans. So we ended up creating two different types of APIs, and we use this API goal canvas to understand who the users are, what they can do, how they can do it, and what inputs they might need and what outputs they will get eventually. So essentially, the API goal canvas allows you to kind of work with those API strategies to understand your users better. And ultimately, we ended up creating two different types of APIs, a get API, which allows you to choose one of the beans before brewing the coffee, which then is reflected in our post brewings API, which allows you to eventually get the coffee. So I have this coffee machine in my building, and I can choose exactly what type of coffee I'd like. And so this was an inspiration behind this API that we wanted to design. So when it comes to working with these, we thought about these different design concerns. And the first concern that we thought about is naming. So when it comes to naming is a crucial aspect when it comes to building an API that stands the test of time. So when it comes down to user friendliness, consistent naming conventions can make your APIs easy to use and easy to understand. So one of the rule of thumbs when it comes to naming is that naming should be consistent at every single level. And this includes endpoint names, method names, response codes. So we wanted to allow people to guess how our API works, and to understand how the API works, the best way to do that is through naming. And so in our example, we use the get request called beans that provides a list of all of the beans elements. And we use beans -bean ID for a singular element. So there's a better practice here not to mix up singular and plurals. Like for example, get beans plus get bean /bean ID. This can introduce a lot of complexities. So if you're going with get beans, you want to go with get beans -bean ID as your naming convention. So the idea here is to stay consistent, and you'll ensure that you'll have an API that can withstand more changes as it goes. So the other aspect that I wanted to share is data types. So APIs that use data types define the structure of data that is being sent or received by the system. So without the proper data typing, there are many different errors that can be used and interpreted when it comes to incorrect outputs or unintended consequences. So in our example, for our get beans, we designed this property for price. So when it comes to working with price, you can work with a data type of number, or you can work with a data type of currency as well. So in our case, we used a number to return the amount, as well as a currency, which returns some sort of ISO values, which provides much more consistency in terms of what we're outputting to our users. So making sure the right data types are returned for your APIs, and not to confuse them with various other data types, because there's a lot of interoperability in this case. This should be consistent throughout your APIs as well. So the other aspect is the use of required or not required parameters. So basically, required and not required parameters essentially help the user increase their time to first call. So with required parameters, these are the parameters that must be included in an API request to receive a valid response. So they're essential for ensuring that an API can process a request and provide the accurate data. Whereas the non-required parameters, on the other hand, are optional and not necessary for the API to function properly. So in this case, when you want to reach time to first call, you want to think about the parameters that are most required, the minimal viable required parameters to get somebody to hit your API endpoint successfully, also ensuring that they're getting the right amount of information back. So in this case, with our Bean API, our Brewings API, we wanted to require, of course, just the type of bean, but what we kept as not required are the milk type, the roast type. So for example, you can brew a coffee without requiring a roast type or a milk type, but you'll still get a successful coffee. But those parameters would just be set as default. So if you don't require your roast type, you'll probably get the default value. And if you don't require your milk type, which is either almonds or oat or whole milk, you'll probably get some sort of default value. So at the very end, you will get a successful API response, but it depends on how much you want to set as a required identifier versus default identifier. And then ultimately, this leads to error handling, which is one of the most important aspects of working with APIs. So with error handling, it's often overlooked when it comes to what kind of errors am I going to send my users. So oftentimes when your API is not sent correctly, you can send a user a 400 bad request. So if you don't provide your user with the right output of what is missing, it can be hard for a user to use that API again. So if I'm just sending them a 400 request, I'm not fully showing them what has gone wrong with their implementation of the API. So in this example, you see that there is an error with my post request. I have an error with the data I'm sending. But I don't offer any information to the user as to what exactly has gone wrong. So let's take a look at that example in a little bit more detail. I have a demo of what that looks like. So here I have my brewings API, and as I've shown you, so with our beans API, we have required these types of beans, so Tanzania, Hawaiian, and this type of bean, Kapeng Bacaro. And then we also have, in our post API, we have set up some of our enumerations for the type of beans that are available, as well as the different roast types, as well as the different milk types that we can send our API as well. So with this particular API, I want to show you an example of what it looks like if I were to send this API in a way where I'm trying to brew this coffee. So here, this is how I'm sending this API. Here are the milk types that I have, and here are the roast types. So in this case, you know that there's an error here with the bean, and I'm sending a 400 bad request. However, if I send this API, I can see that the error I'm getting is that the coffee is not brewing, and it tells me that the bean is required to brew a coffee. So maybe that's enough information for me to successfully fix this API or use that API again. However, if I were to use a API that looks like this, I can get exactly more data on exactly where the location of that API is. And I'm also getting a 400 bad request, but I'm getting some more data back from that API, and I can see exactly what property is missing. I can take this API even a step further and take a look at basically sending this API, and I'm also getting more information about what is required to brew the coffee. For example, we don't need Ben to brew the coffee. In this case, I provided a milk type as well that is not part of my API, since I mentioned that my default values are whole, almond, and oat. So when I provide a value that the API can't take, I also provide data back to the user as to how to fix those values. So as you can see, being able to send the right error messages back to your users allows them to work with that API again, fix their issues, and ensure that they're able to get a proper response. And in this case, we're showing exactly what properties are that we have and which properties are all good. So in this case, at least I gave it the right property for roast type, which is light, and I can see that was run successful. However, we don't have this particular type of bean, a milk type, and then this is the bean type that we have. So as you can see, the right way to error handle, where you're sending the errors as well as the data you want back, this is so crucial into creating an API that stands the test of time, that can evolve and that can be used and reused and worked with by your users. So this can be a really interesting use case in terms of working with this API. And of course, if you're working with not a coffee machine and you're working with a tea machine, you can always write the 418. So this is an incorrect message. So in that case, but I hope this gives you a little bit more insight into working with APIs. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about how to design for humans and creating human-centric experiences, I have a blog post that kind of highlights essentially all of the aspects of working with multiple APIs and how to make APIs more usable, and goes through these aspects of naming as well as data types, required, not required, and working with error handling. So we have in-depth videos into why these features are important to your use case. And then if you're also interested in working with API first design, you can learn about API first design and what are the differences between API first as well as API first design and the 8 traits of the effective API first design, which is done by my colleague Arno. So yeah, I hope this gives you a better understanding of working with APIs and how to make APIs a little bit more robust, being able to have the right ability to handle errors, as well as naming your APIs correctly, working with the right data types, and then requiring the right fields that reduce the most time to first call is critical when it comes to designing APIs. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn or on Twitter, and feel free to reach out to me to learn more.
Thank you so much, Pooja. That was quite interesting. So there is a question from the audience. It says, Pooja, what kind of intersection do you see with LLMs and Postman as developers looking to improve and better optimize their workflows? We have 2 minutes, please.
So I'm actually a little bit unfamiliar with LLMs. So maybe that's a question that I need to take that back to my team. But I feel like there's a lot of intersection, especially if you're API-based platform. It depends on what kind of user you'd identify as, whether you're a producer of APIs. So I think I showed that you can design APIs within Postman. I believe I showed that you can, in the API section, you're able to design your APIs accordingly, and so that helps as a producer. And then you can also consume your APIs and test your APIs on the collection side as well. So depends on where you identify as in that case.
Excellent. So there's another question. We have 1 more minute. Are there any plans for Postman to release certifications that developers can take to solidify their knowledge in APIs development?
Yeah, so there's many certifications when it comes to working with Postman. So one of the best ways to get certification is we have badges. So the one badge that is really useful is the 30 days of Postman for developers. So with that badge, you can learn about all things that Postman has to offer, and you can get this 30 days badge as well. And so if you go to, just search about Postman badges or even search Postman Intergalactic, you're able to get lots of training and certifications as well.
Excellent. So Pooja, our time is up. Thank you so much for your participation. I think it was very interesting. So thank you. And the audience have already your contact details. So if you have any questions, you can contact her. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.